Have you ever seen a woman stripped of her dignity on the happiest day of her life? Picture a modest bride standing in the pouring rain, sobbing as a billionaire heiress steals her dream wedding venue. They called her poor. They called her trash. They tossed her out like garbage onto the wet gravel. But they had absolutely no idea the quiet man she was marrying could buy their entire existence with a single phone call. Buckle up, because this revenge is absolutely ruthless. Raindrops battered the windshield of Krista Flores' 10-year-old Toyota sedan as she pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of the Beaumont Caldwell estate. Nestled deep within the lush, rolling hills of the Hudson Valley, the estate was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, boasting sprawling manicured gardens, imported Italian marble fountains, and a grand ballroom adorned with authentic Murano crystal chandeliers. It was the kind of venue featured in the glossy pages of Vogue weddings and exclusively reserved by Wall Street tycoons, tech billionaires, and old money socialites. Krista did not fit into any of those categories. She was a freelance restorer of antique books, a woman who wore modest, practical clothing from Zara and spent her evenings carefully mending torn spines of 18th century literature. Her fiancé, Henry, was an equally unassuming man. He worked in finance, or so she thought, and drove an unremarkable Volvo, preferring quiet nights at home with homemade pasta over extravagant outings. Yet, by some sheer miracle 2 years ago, Krista had secured the Beaumont Caldwell estate for their wedding. She had capitalized on a sudden cancellation, negotiated a steeply discounted off-season rate, and poured every single penny of her life savings into the deposit. Today was supposed to be the final walkthrough. The wedding was exactly 48 hours away. Krista parked her sputtering car next to a gleaming lineup of sleek black Range Rovers, pulling her trench coat tight against the autumn chill as she hurried up the sweeping limestone steps. Her heart fluttered with nervous excitement. She had spent 2 years handcrafting her own centerpieces, thrifting vintage silver candle holders, and meticulously planning every second of the ceremony. As she pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors, the scent of expensive Joe Malone wood sage candles washed over her. Waiting for her in the grand foyer was Victoria Preston, the estate's notoriously cutthroat general manager. Victoria was a woman composed entirely of sharp angles and expensive tastes. Dressed in a pristine white Chanel tweed suit, her wrists heavy with Cartier love bracelets, she surveyed Krista with a look of undisguised revulsion. It was the kind of look a homeowner might give a rodent scurrying across a pristine kitchen floor. "Miss Flores," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that failed to reach her ice-cold blue eyes. "I was just about to have my assistant call you. Though, honestly, I assumed you would have checked your email before making the drive." Krista paused, her smile faltering as she lowered her dripping umbrella. "My email? Is something wrong with the catering setup? I brought the final seating charts." "There is no seating chart, Miss Flores, because there is no wedding," Victoria interrupted, waving a perfectly manicured hand as if swatting away a fly. "Your reservation for this Saturday has been formally canceled." The words hit Krista like a physical blow to the chest. The grand foyer, with its towering vaulted ceilings and priceless Flemish tapestries, suddenly felt like it was spinning. "Canceled? What are you talking about? My wedding is in 2 days. I have 150 guests flying in. I paid the final balance 3 months ago. Here, I have the contract right here in my bag." Krista frantically dug into her worn leather tote, producing a slightly crumpled manila folder. She pulled out the signed agreement, her hands trembling violently. Victoria didn't even bother looking at the document. She simply sighed, an exaggerated sound of profound boredom. "Yes, you paid a heavily discounted rate during an administrative oversight 2 years ago. However, if you actually bothered to read Section 4, Paragraph 9 of your contract, you would see the estate retains the right to cancel any event if the management deems the aesthetic or logistical execution of said event to be incompatible with the luxury standards of the Beaumont Caldwell brand. And frankly, Miss Flores, Your little DIY mason jar aesthetic and cheap grocery store flowers are deeply off-brand for us." "This is a joke," Krista whispered, her voice cracking as the sheer cruelty of the statement sank in. "You can't do this. I gave you my life savings. My grandmother is on a plane from Scotland right now. You can't just kick me out 48 hours before I walk down the aisle." "I assure you I can, and I have," Victoria sneered, stepping closer, her expensive perfume suddenly suffocating. "The estate has fully refunded your pathetic little deposit. It should hit your modest little bank account in 5 to 7 business days. Now I have a very important client arriving at any moment, and I cannot have you cluttering up the lobby looking like a drowned rat." Before Krista could formulate a response through her rising panic and tears, the heavy mahogany doors swung open again. A gust of cold wind swept into the foyer, accompanied by a woman who looked like she had just stepped off a Paris runway. It was Corinne Harris, the infamous, wildly spoiled daughter of a New York real estate magnate. Corinne was dripping in head-to-toe Balenciaga, her blonde hair flawlessly blown out despite the weather, flanked by 2 burly bodyguards and a frantic-looking event coordinator holding a clipboard. "Victoria, darling," Corinne announced, her voice echoing shrilly off the marble walls. "Tell me the floral arch is going to be big enough. If the David Austin roses aren't cascading all the way down the grand staircase, I am literally going to fire everyone." Victoria's entire demeanor shifted instantly. The cold, reptilian manager melted into a fawning, subservient sycophant. "Corinne, sweetheart. Oh, the roses are spectacular, imported straight from Ecuador this morning. Everything is perfect for your Saturday evening ceremony. The entire estate is yours." Krista froze. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Her wedding hadn't been canceled because of a contract loophole about aesthetics. It had been canceled because Corinne Harris wanted the venue at the last minute, and Victoria had sold Krista out to the highest bidder. "You gave her my weekend," Krista stated, her voice shaking with a mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. "You sold my wedding day." Corinne finally noticed Krista standing there, clutching her cheap manila folder. The heiress looked Krista up and down, her lips curling into a cruel, mocking smirk. "Victoria, who is this person? Why is she dripping on the vintage Persian rug?" "Nobody, Miss Harris. Just a canceled booking who was just leaving," Victoria said, shooting Krista a venomous glare. "I am not leaving," Krista shouted, the devastation finally breaking through her polite exterior. "I booked this venue 2 years ago. I have a legally binding contract. You can't just throw me out because some spoiled brat waved daddy's credit card in your face." Corinne let out a sharp, theatrical laugh, adjusting the massive 5-carat diamond on her left hand. "Oh, honey, that's exactly how the world works. I decided on Tuesday I wanted a countryside aesthetic for my wedding, and Daddy made it happen. You should really learn your place. You're lucky they even let you step foot in a place like this. Go have your little reception at a local diner where you belong." "You vile, disgusting..." Krista lunged forward, not to strike Corinne, but to shove her contract into Victoria's chest to make her look at the signatures. Before Krista could even close the distance, Corinne's 2 massive bodyguards stepped forward, grabbing Krista harshly by the upper arms. The grip was bruising, brutal, and entirely unnecessary. "Get your hands off me," Krista screamed, thrashing against their iron grips. "Throw her out," Victoria commanded coldly, checking her Cartier watch. "And if she sets foot on the property again, call the local sheriff and have her arrested for trespassing." The bodyguards dragged Krista backward across the slick marble floor. She fought, she cried, she begged, but it was useless. They hauled her out the front doors and shoved her violently down the limestone steps. Krista stumbled in her sensible heels, falling hard onto the wet gravel driveway. The rough stones scraped her palms, drawing beads of crimson, and her knees slammed into the unforgiving earth. Her beautiful, carefully organized wedding binder spilled open, sending hand-painted seating cards and fabric swatches fluttering into the mud and pouring rain. The heavy doors of the estate slammed shut. The lock clicked. Krista sat in the freezing mud for a long time, the rain soaking through her thin coat, completely destroying her carefully laid plans and breaking her spirit. The sheer humiliation of being tossed out like trash, of being mocked for her lack of wealth, crushed her entirely. Shaking uncontrollably from the cold and the shock, she crawled to her knees, frantically gathering her muddy, ruined seating cards. She retreated to her freezing Toyota, locking the doors and resting her forehead against the steering wheel. She broke down into ugly, breathless sobs. Her dream was dead. Her family was arriving tomorrow. She had to tell Henry that everything they had saved for was gone. With trembling, mud-stained fingers, she pulled out her phone and dialed Henry's number. He answered on the second ring, his deep, soothing voice instantly making her cry harder. "Hey, darling," Henry said warmly. "How did the walkthrough go? Did they figure out where to put the string quartet?" "Henry," Krista choked out, gasping for air. "Henry, they canceled it. They threw me out. They literally dragged me out into the rain. Our rich girl wanted our weekend and they tore up the contract. It's gone. The wedding is ruined." There was a long, terrifying pause on the other end of the line. The usual warmth in Henry's voice vanished, replaced by a cold, deadly silence that Krista had never heard before. "Krista," Henry said softly, the tone sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Where are you right now?" "In the parking lot," she sobbed. "Henry, I don't know what to do. I'm so embarrassed. They called me poor. They told me I belonged in a diner." "Lock your doors. Do not drive. I will be there in 30 minutes, Henry commanded, his voice eerily calm, possessing a strange, aristocratic authority she had never noticed before. "Henry, there's nothing we can do. They have security. They have lawyers." "Krista, listen to me," Henry interrupted gently but firmly. "You're going to have your wedding at the Beaumont Caldwell estate this Saturday. I promise you, just sit tight. Let me make a phone call." 30 miles away, in a sleek but understated office in downtown Manhattan, Henry Arthur Leopold hung up his cell phone. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered in his cheek. He stood up from his desk, the facade of the mild-mannered financial analyst melting away in an instant. For 4 years, Henry had lived under the radar in America, adopting the surname Davies, driving a Volvo, and living a quiet, beautiful life with Krista. What Krista didn't know, what no one in New York knew, was that Henry was a direct descendant of the House of Cassel-Lorraine, one of the oldest, most obscenely wealthy royal bloodlines in Northern Europe. His family didn't just have money, they had sovereign wealth. The kind of money that could topple small governments and buy out Fortune 500 companies on a whim. Henry had hidden his identity specifically to find someone who loved him for him, not for his titles or his trust fund. Krista was the love of his life, a pure, kind soul who asked for nothing, and someone had just thrown her into the mud. Henry bypassed his normal desktop phone and pulled a heavily encrypted black satellite phone from a locked drawer in his desk. He dialed a private international number. It rang exactly once before being answered. "Your Grace," a crisp, polished British voice answered. It was Lord Reginald Sterling. Wait, no. Lord Reginald Hawthorne, the senior manager of the Royal Trust at Coutts & Co., the exclusive private bank of the European elite. "Reginald," Henry said, his voice dropping to a frigid, commanding baritone. "I need a corporate acquisition executed immediately. I don't care what time it is in London. Wake up the board." "Of course, Your Grace. What is the target?" "The Beaumont Caldwell estate in the Hudson Valley, New York. Find out who holds the deed. Find the parent company. I want a hostile, unrefusable cash buyout executed in the next 5 minutes." Keys clacked rapidly on the other end of the line. "One moment, Your Grace. The property is owned by a private equity firm, Vanguard Hospitality Holdings. Interestingly, they are highly leveraged, bleeding cash. They've been quietly shopping the property around for months to avoid bankruptcy." "What is the market valuation?" Henry demanded. "Roughly $15 million US, Your Grace." "Offer them $45 million. Henry snapped without hesitation. Cash. Complete transfer of deeds and operational control effective immediately. No contingencies, no cooling off period. Wire the funds from the primary sovereign account. Have our legal team at Clifford Chance draft the acquisition papers and get a senior partner to the estate right now. Oh, I want the current management fired and evicted before I arrive. Consider it done, Your Grace, Reginald said smoothly, completely unfazed by the deployment of $45 million. The wire transfer will clear within 3 minutes. Back at the Beaumont Caldwell estate, the atmosphere was one of triumphant celebration. Corinne Harris was standing on the grand staircase, sipping a glass of vintage Dom Perignon, while demanding her wedding planner change the color of the silk drapes in the ballroom. Victoria Preston hovered nearby, holding Corinne's Pomeranian, basking in the glow of the massive tip she had just received from Corinne's father for securing the venue. Honestly, Victoria, Corinne laughed, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. That peasant girl earlier was so pathetic. Did you see her little handmade binder? It looked like a middle school art project. Tragic, really, Victoria smirked, scratching the dog behind its ears. Some people simply refuse to understand that this level of luxury is reserved for a certain class. I'm just glad we got the trash taken out before your photographer arrived. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors didn't just open. They were thrown wide. The wind howled into the foyer, but it wasn't just the weather making an entrance. A terrifyingly synchronized motorcade of 4 pitch-black Mercedes-Maybach SUVs had just parked directly on the pristine front lawn, ignoring the driveway entirely. Out of the lead vehicle stepped a tall, imposing man in a bespoke Savile Row suit, clutching a leather briefcase. He was flanked by 4 massive men wearing earpieces and tactical tailored suits, royal protection officers. Victoria frowned, handing the Pomeranian back to Corinne. Excuse me, what do you think you're doing parking on the grass? Who are you? The man in the suit walked straight past Corinne, his polished Oxford shoes echoing sharply against the marble. He stopped directly in front of Victoria, looking at her with the cold detachment of an executioner. Are you Victoria Preston, general manager of the Beaumont Caldwell estate? The man asked, his sharp British accent cutting through the room. I am, Victoria said, puffing out her chest, trying to project authority. And you are trespassing on a private venue. If you don't leave immediately, I will have my security. My name is Alistair Covington, the man interrupted flawlessly. Senior partner at Clifford Chance, representing the Royal Sovereign Trust of the House of Cassel-Lorraine. As of precisely 2 minutes and 14 seconds ago, my client purchased Vanguard Hospitality Holdings in its entirety. This includes the deed, the grounds, the fixtures, and the operational control of this estate. Victoria scoffed, looking around nervously, thinking this was some sort of elaborate prank. Purchased? That's impossible. You can't just buy an estate in 5 minutes. Covington didn't blink. He calmly unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of freshly printed, legally binding transfer documents, complete with digital wire transfer receipts stamped with the seal of Coutts & Company. He slapped the paperwork onto a nearby marble table. $45 million in liquid capital tends to expedite the paperwork, Miss Preston, Covington stated coldly. The estate now belongs entirely to my client, and my client has issued his first 2 executive orders as the new owner. Corinne Harris stepped forward, her face turning crimson with outrage. I don't care who bought what. My father is Marcus Harris. I rented this venue for the weekend, and my wedding is happening here on Saturday. I have a contract. Covington finally turned his gaze to the billionaire heiress, looking at her as if she were a mild annoyance. Actually, Miss Harris, you do not. According to Section 4, Paragraph 9 of your standard agreement, a loophole Miss Preston here is apparently quite fond of exploiting. The management retains the right to cancel any event deemed incompatible with our luxury standards. And the new owner finds your presence here aesthetically offensive. Corinne's jaw dropped in absolute shock. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering into 100 pieces on the marble floor. Executive Order Number 1, Covington continued, turning his icy gaze back to Victoria. Miss Harris's event is immediately and permanently cancelled. Executive Order Number 2, Miss Preston. Your employment is hereby terminated, effective instantly. You have exactly 3 minutes to vacate the premises before my security team physically removes you for trespassing. Victoria's face drained of all color. She looked at the towering Royal Protection officers, then at the paperwork. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized her chest. Fired. You can't fire me. I've run this estate for a decade. Who is this client? Who authorized this? Before Covington could answer, the roar of a Volvo engine cut through the rain outside. The car parked abruptly behind the Maybach. The front door opened and Henry stepped out into the rain, his jaw set in a line of pure, unyielding fury. He didn't walk up the steps. He stalked up them, exuding an aura of raw power that made the heavily armed security officers immediately step aside and bow their heads in deep reverence. Henry walked into the grand foyer, locking eyes with Victoria Preston. I authorized it, Henry said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a death knell. And you are exactly 2 minutes away from being dragged out of my house. Victoria Preston stared at the man standing in the doorway, her mind completely failing to process the reality unfolding before her. She recognized him from a single, blurry photograph in Krista's cheap plastic wedding binder. This was supposed to be the unremarkable fiancé, the mid-level finance drone who drove a Swedish family car and couldn't afford a premium floral package. Yet, standing here now, surrounded by a phalanx of elite security personnel, Henry exuded a terrifying, aristocratic dominance. His tailored charcoal overcoat was dripping with rainwater, but he wore it like armor. The air in the grand foyer seemed to turn to ice the moment he locked eyes with her. You? Victoria stammered, her voice losing all its polished arrogance, dropping into a harsh, frantic pitch. You are the buyer? That is absolutely impossible. You're Krista Flores's fiancé. You couldn't even afford the peak season premium fee. I allowed Krista to negotiate a budget because it brought her joy to plan this wedding herself, Henry replied, his voice deadly calm, every syllable dripping with lethal precision. I hid my wealth from her because I wanted a woman who loved me, not a woman who saw my bank accounts as a personal ATM. Krista is a woman of unparalleled grace. You, Miss Preston, are a parasite who threw my future wife into the mud. Corinne Harris, having recovered slightly from the shock of dropping her vintage champagne, decided this was the moment to reassert her dominance. She stepped forward, her face twisted in a mask of spoiled, venomous outrage. Listen to me, you psychotic loser, Corinne spat, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger in Henry's direction. I don't care what kind of fake paperwork your little rent-a lawyer just printed out. My father is Richard Harris, Harris Commercial Real Estate. He practically owns Manhattan. If you think you can just walk in here and cancel my wedding, he will bury you in litigation until you are completely bankrupt. Henry didn't even flinch. He slowly unbuttoned his overcoat, revealing a perfectly tailored Brioni suit beneath. He looked at Corinne not with anger, but with profound, devastating pity. He turned slightly toward his lawyer. Alistair, Henry said smoothly, refresh my memory. Does the Royal Sovereign Trust have any current holdings involving Harris Commercial Real Estate? Alistair Covington adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses, consulting a sleek, encrypted iPad he pulled from his leather briefcase. He didn't even need to look for long. Yes, Your Grace. It appears Harris Commercial Real Estate is heavily overleveraged. They recently took out a massive restructuring loan through Deutsche Bank to avoid defaulting on 3 major midtown properties. The Royal Trust is the primary underwriter for that specific debt portfolio. Henry turned his gaze back to the billionaire heiress, who suddenly looked as though all the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. Your father doesn't own Manhattan, Miss Harris, Henry whispered, his voice echoing like a final judgment in the cavernous marble hall. I do. And if you do not vacate my property in the next 60 seconds, I will make a single phone call to Deutsche Bank and call in your father's loans in full by tomorrow morning. Your wedding won't just be canceled, Your family will be liquidating your penthouses and selling your Balenciaga bags on the street to cover the margins. Corinne's face drained of all color, shifting from a flushed, angry red to a sickly, translucent white. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the power standing before her finally penetrated her spoiled, insulated world. She looked frantically at her two burly bodyguards, expecting them to do something, but they were seasoned professionals. They took one look at the heavily armed Royal Protection officers flanking Henry and smartly took a step back, refusing to engage. "Time is up," Henry announced, checking the platinum Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. "Security." The four massive Royal Protection officers moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency. Two of them flanked Corinne Harris, gripping her firmly by the elbows. The other two descended upon Victoria Preston. "No, wait, you can't do this!" Victoria shrieked, as her feet were quite literally lifted off the marble floor. "I have items in my office. I have personal belongings." "They will be shipped to you in standard cardboard boxes," Alistair Covington noted dryly, gathering his legal documents. "Henry, please, Mr. Davies, or whoever you are," Victoria begged, thrashing against the unyielding grip of the security men. Her Chanel suit wrinkled, her pristine hair falling into her face. "I can fix this. I can arrange the ballroom for Krista exactly how she wanted. Let me make it right." "You had your chance to be a decent human being, Miss Preston," Henry said, completely devoid of empathy. "Throw them out." The doors were hauled open. The cold, driving rain swept into the foyer once more. With a ruthless lack of ceremony, the security officers tossed Victoria, Preston, and Corinne Harris down the sweeping limestone steps. Corinne stumbled in her designer heels, landing awkwardly on the wet gravel, while Victoria slid entirely into a freezing puddle, her expensive tweed suit instantly soaked with mud. Corinne's panicked event coordinator scrambled out after them, clutching her clipboard like a shield. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut. The deadbolts clicked into place. The silence that fell over the grand foyer was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the massive arched windows. Henry stood in the center of his newly acquired $45 million estate, let out a long, shuddering breath, and ran a hand through his damp hair. The aristocratic wrath faded from his eyes, quickly replaced by a desperate, agonizing panic. His bride was still outside in the cold. Krista sat shivering in the driver's seat of her Toyota, the heater blasting at maximum capacity, but doing absolutely nothing to thaw the ice in her veins. Her palms were stinging, wrapped in a few rough paper napkins from her glove compartment to stop the bleeding where the gravel had cut her. Her beautiful, handmade seating cards lay ruined in a muddy pile on the passenger seat. She had seen the terrifying, pitch-black motorcade roar onto the lawn. She had seen Henry's Volvo pull up behind them. And just moments ago, she had watched through the rain-streaked windshield in absolute bewilderment as Victoria Preston and Corinne Harris were physically thrown out the front doors of the estate, tumbling into the mud exactly as she had. Krista's mind was short-circuiting. None of this made sense. Who were those men in the tactical suits? Why was Henry inside the building? A sharp tap on her driver's side window made her gasp. She turned to see Henry standing in the pouring rain, completely ignoring the torrential downpour ruining his expensive suit. His eyes, usually so calm and warm, were frantic with worry. Krista fumbled with the locks and pushed the door open. Before she could even speak, Henry dropped to his knees right there in the freezing mud, utterly disregarding his tailored trousers. He reached into the car, taking her bruised, scraped hands into his own, with a gentleness that made fresh tears spill down Krista's cheeks. "Krista," he breathed, his voice cracking with raw emotion as he examined the cuts on her palms. "Oh my God, Krista. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry. I should have been here. I should have protected you from this." "Henry, what is happening?" She sobbed, completely overwhelmed. Who were those men? Why did Victoria get thrown out? Did you call the police? I will explain everything. I swear it to you, he said softly, pressing a kiss to her bruised knuckles. He stood up, shrugging off his heavy, dry charcoal overcoat, and draped it over her shivering shoulders. It smelled like expensive cedar wood and his familiar, comforting cologne. But first, I need to get you out of the cold. Come with me. I can't go back in there, Henry. Krista panicked, shrinking back into the seat. They'll arrest us. The manager no longer works here, Henry interrupted, his voice returning to that strange, quiet authority she had heard on the phone. And it is impossible for you to trespass on your own property. Krista froze. What? Henry gently pulled her from the car, wrapping his arm firmly around her waist to support her trembling frame. He escorted her up the limestone steps, the massive security guards at the top immediately snapping to attention and hauling the heavy mahogany doors open for them. As Krista stepped back into the grand foyer, the atmosphere was entirely different. The remaining estate staff, the head chef, the groundskeeper, and a team of housekeepers were lined up in the hallway. The moment Krista and Henry crossed the threshold, the entire staff bowed their heads in synchronized, profound respect. Alistair Covington stepped forward, offering a crisp bow. Your Grace, the transfer is entirely complete. The previous management has been permanently removed from the premises, and Vanguard Hospitality Holdings has officially relinquished all operational control to the Royal Trust. Krista stopped dead in her tracks, her muddy shoes ruining the vintage Persian rug, though no one seemed to care in the slightest. She stared at Alistair, then turned her wide, terrified eyes up to Henry. Your Grace? Krista repeated, her voice a fragile whisper. Henry, what did he just call you? Henry took a deep breath, gently guiding her to a plush velvet settee near the roaring marble fireplace. He sat her down, kneeling on the floor in front of her so he was looking up into her eyes. He took her hands again, holding them tightly. Krista, when we met at that coffee shop 2 years ago, I told you my name was Henry Davies, that I was a financial analyst from London, transferred to New York to crunch numbers. That wasn't a complete lie. I do analyze finances, and I am from London. He paused, swallowing hard, the vulnerability in his eyes entirely genuine. But Davies is a pseudonym, an alias I adopted to live a normal life in America. Krista's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. A normal life away from what, Henry? Away from the crown, Henry confessed softly. My full name is His Royal Highness, Prince Henry Arthur Leopold of the House of Cassel-Lorraine. I am the Duke of Arden, the second in line to a sovereign European principality and the primary beneficiary of the Royal Sovereign Trust. The words hit Krista like a physical weight. The grand ballroom, the sweeping staircase, the sudden arrival of elite bodyguards, it all violently snapped into focus. The man she had been sharing a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with, the man who argued with her over which brand of generic paper towels to buy, was royalty. Wake. You're a prince, she stated flatly, her brain refusing to process the sheer magnitude of the revelation. I am, Henry nodded, his expression pleading for her understanding. I hid it because my entire life, people have only ever wanted me for the title, for the wealth. Women threw themselves at me to secure a crown. Fade, business partners lied to me to secure investments. It was a suffocating, isolated existence. I came to America to breathe. And then I found you. He reached up, gently wiping a raindrop from her cheek. You loved me when you thought I made $60,000 a year. You loved me when we ate ramen noodles on the floor of our apartment. You are the purest, most beautiful soul I have ever known. I was going to tell you the truth after the wedding, when we were safely away on our honeymoon in Switzerland. But when you called me today, when you told me they humiliated you and threw you in the dirt because they thought you were poor. Henry's jaw clenched, the aristocratic wrath flashing in his eyes once more. I bought the estate, Krista. I bought the parent company that owns it. The Beaumont Caldwell estate now belongs to you. It is your wedding present. No one will ever disrespect you again. Tomorrow my family's private decorators are flying in from Paris. We are going to throw the most spectacular wedding this state has ever seen. Krista stared at him, tears welling in her eyes once more, but this time they weren't born of humiliation. They were born of absolute, overwhelming shock and a strange, profound sense of awe. She had spent 2 years clipping coupons and thrifting centerpieces, completely unaware that the man holding her hand could have bought the entire Hudson Valley with a single signature. "You bought an entire estate in 5 minutes?" Krista whispered, a tiny disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. $45 million in cash tends to motivate private equity firms. Alistair Covington chimed in unhelpfully from across the room, adjusting his glasses. Henry shot the lawyer a withering glare before turning his full, adoring attention back to Krista. "I would have bought the entire state of New York if it meant making you smile again. The wedding is on, my love. Exactly the way you want it." Morning broke over the Hudson Valley, painting the autumn sky in brilliant shades of bruised purple and spun gold. The torrential rain of the previous day had vanished, leaving the manicured grounds of the Beaumont Caldwell estate glistening and vibrant. Krista awoke in the master suite of the estate, her limbs tangled in sheets woven from Egyptian cotton so fine they felt like spun water. For a brief, disorienting second, she thought the entire ordeal of the previous afternoon had been a stress-induced nightmare. Then she saw the antique silver tea service resting on the mahogany nightstand, complete with a crested porcelain cup and a handwritten note bearing the seal of the House of Cassel-Lorraine. "My beautiful Krista, sleep as long as you need. The world is being remade for you today. Yours entirely, Henry." She threw off the covers and padded barefoot to the massive bay windows overlooking the front lawn. Her jaw dropped. The estate grounds were utterly unrecognizable from the quiet, rainy property she had been thrown out of yesterday. A fleet of sleek, unmarked luxury trucks was parked along the limestone driveway. Dozens of people wearing crisp black uniforms and discreet earpieces were moving with military precision. They were unloading towering scaffolding, miles of silver-threaded organza, and wooden crates stamped with the logos of Europe's most exclusive design houses. Henry had promised that her vision would not be erased, but elevated. Krista watched in absolute awe as an army of florists began constructing her dream aesthetic on a colossal, royal scale. The modest grocery store centerpieces she had planned were being replaced by thousands of rare, pale blush peonies and wild English garden roses flown in overnight from the All-Smear flower auction in the Netherlands. Hand-blown Venetian crystal lanterns were being hung from the ancient oak trees, mimicking the mason jar aesthetic she adored, but upgraded to museum-quality glass that fractured the morning light into a million dazzling prisms. A gentle knock at the heavy oak door broke her trance. "Come in," Krista called out, instinctively pulling her silk robe tighter around her shoulders. The door opened to reveal a tall, impossibly elegant woman, dressed in a flawlessly tailored Dior day dress, her silver hair pulled back into a severe chignon. She carried a leather portfolio and was followed by 3 assistants holding garment bags. "Good morning, Your Grace," the woman said, dipping into a flawless curtsy that made Krista blush furiously. "Oh, please, you don't have to do that," Krista stammered, waving her hands. I'm just Krista. You are the future Duchess of Arden, madam," the woman replied with a warm, maternal smile, stepping fully into the room. "My name is Genevieve Laurent. I am the chief event architect for His Royal Highness's family. Prince Henry summoned us from Paris the moment the acquisition of this property was finalized last night. We have 36 hours to execute a royal wedding protocol, and I assure you, my team thrives under pressure." Krista was entirely overwhelmed. Genevieve, I had my dress already. I bought it at a boutique in Brooklyn. And it is a lovely garment, madam, which we will preserve perfectly, Genevieve assured her, signaling to her assistants. But His Royal Highness requested that you have options fitting for a royal bride, should you desire them. We took the liberty of waking up the head designers at Elie Saab and Oscar de la Renta. The assistants unzipped the garment bags, revealing 3 custom-made, breathtakingly intricate wedding gowns. They were masterpieces of haute couture, dripping with pearls, hand-embroidered Chantilly lace, and shimmering Swarovski crystals. Krista stared at them, the reality of marrying a European prince finally sinking into her bones. She wasn't just marrying a kind man who liked vintage books. She was marrying into an ancient, unfathomably wealthy dynasty. Downstairs, Henry was holding court in the estate's grand library. The mild-mannered financial analyst was completely gone. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his posture rigid and commanding, reviewing a stack of security protocols presented by Alastair Covington and the head of the Royal Protection Detail. We have secured a 5-mile perimeter around the estate, Your Grace, the head of security reported, pointing to a digital map on a tablet. Local law enforcement has been completely bypassed. The FAA has granted our requests for a temporary no-fly zone to prevent paparazzi helicopters. Your guest list of 150 individuals has been vetted, and luxury transport has been arranged to bring them directly from their hotels to the gates. Excellent, Henry murmured, signing off on a document with a gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. And Krista's family? Her grandmother, Mrs. Beatrice Flores, landed at JFK an hour ago. We dispatched the private helicopter to bypass Manhattan traffic. She will be landing on the South Lawn in approximately 10 minutes. Henry smiled genuinely for the first time that morning. Thank you, Alastair. See to it that Beatrice is given the royal guest suite on the 2nd floor. Of course, Your Grace, Alastair said, pausing before he closed his briefcase. There is one more matter. Richard Harris has been calling my direct line frantically for the past 3 hours. It seems Deutsche Bank initiated an immediate audit of his commercial properties at dawn, citing sudden instability in his debt portfolio. He is acutely aware that the Royal Trust is the executioner. Henry's eyes went dark, the aristocratic wrath returning to his features like a sudden winter storm. Let him panic. I want his empire trembling before I even consider picking up the phone. 70 miles south, in a $30 million penthouse overlooking Central Park, the atmosphere was one of absolute, suffocating terror. Corinne Harris sat on a custom velvet sofa, nervously picking at the cuticle of her thumb until it bled. She had been crying for hours, her pristine blowout ruined, her mascara smudged into dark, pathetic circles under her eyes. Across the room, her father, Richard Harris, was pacing like a caged tiger. Richard was a ruthless real estate magnate, a man who built his empire on intimidation and hostile takeovers. But right now, his face was the color of ash. "Do you understand what you have done?" Richard roared, violently sweeping a crystal decanter off his mahogany desk. It shattered against the wall, splashing amber liquid across the priceless wallpaper. Corinne flinched, pulling her knees to her chest. "Daddy, I didn't know." How was I supposed to know he was a prince? He drives a 10-year-old Volvo. His fiancée was holding a binder made of cardboard. "Because you are an arrogant, spoiled idiot," Richard bellowed, his chest heaving. He pointed a shaking finger at his daughter. "You threw the future Duchess of Arden into the mud. You evicted a European royal from his own venue. Do you have any concept of the power the House of Castle Lorraine wields? They aren't just rich, Corinne. They are sovereign. They underwrite the global banking systems that keep our lights on." Richard pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, his breathing ragged. "My CFO just called. Deutsche Bank has frozen all of our commercial credit lines. The restructuring loan for the Midtown properties is being recalled. If we don't produce $200 million in liquid cash by Monday morning, we default. The empire collapses. We lose this penthouse. We lose the Hamptons estate. We lose everything. Daddy, please, you can fix this, Corinne sobbed, the reality of poverty. True, inescapable poverty, flashing before her eyes. Call the lawyers, sue them. Sue them? Richard laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound. They own the bank. They own the politicians. The only way we survive this weekend is if Prince Henry decides not to crush us like insects. Get up. What? Corinne sniffled. Get up, Richard barked, grabbing her fiercely by the arm and hauling her off the sofa. Put on a coat. No makeup, no jewelry. We are driving to the Hudson Valley right now. You are going to get on your hands and knees in front of that woman, and you are going to beg for her forgiveness. And if she tells you to eat dirt, you will take a spoon and swallow it. Do you understand me? Corinne felt a wave of profound nausea wash over her. The ultimate humiliation. She had to grovel before the woman she had called trash just 24 hours ago. While the Harris were descending into financial panic, Victoria Preston was experiencing a completely different, yet equally devastating brand of ruin. Victoria sat in her cramped, sterile apartment, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. She was frantically calling every luxury event company, high-end hotel, and elite catering service in the tri-state area. Please, Mr. Henderson, you know my track record, Victoria pleaded, pacing across her cheap laminate floor. I ran the Beaumont Caldwell estate for 10 years. I can double your elite clientele in a month. I'm sorry, Victoria, the icy voice on the other end replied. But as of this morning, a memo circulated through the International Luxury Hospitality Board. You have been permanently blacklisted. The word is that you catastrophically breached a contract and assaulted a VIP client. Anyone who hires you will instantly lose their backing from the European Sovereign Trust. That's a lie. I didn't. Do not call this number again, the man interrupted firmly. The line went dead. Victoria dropped her phone onto the counter, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She was entirely frozen out. 10 years of cutthroat networking, of stepping on people like Krista Flores to climb the social ladder, completely obliterated in 5 minutes. She had sacrificed her humanity to cater to the elite, only to be crushed by a level of wealth and power she couldn't even comprehend. Back at the Beaumont Caldwell estate, Krista was walking across the manicured south lawn, holding Henry's hand. Her grandmother Beatrice, a fiery Scottish woman with a thick brogue and a heart of gold, was lecturing Henry playfully about the humidity while marveling at the colossal floral arches being erected. The heavy iron gates at the front of the estate remained firmly closed, guarded by 4 armed men. A sleek black town car pulled up to the perimeter, entirely dwarfed by the massive royal protection vehicles parked nearby. Alistair Covington approached Henry, stepping discreetly to his side. Your Grace, Richard Harris and his daughter have arrived at the front gate. They are requesting an audience. Mr. Harris explicitly stated they are here to issue a formal apology to Miss Flores. Henry stopped walking. The warmth drained from his posture, instantly replaced by the terrifying cold authority of a sovereign ruler. He looked at Krista, his eyes softening slightly as he gauged her reaction. It is entirely your choice, my love, Henry said softly, squeezing her hand. If you want them gone, I will have them permanently escorted off the premises, and their company will be bankrupt by Monday. If you wish to face them, I will stand by your side. Krista looked toward the heavy iron gates in the distance. She thought about the pouring rain. She thought about the bruising grip of the bodyguards, the sting of the gravel scraping her palms, and the cruel, mocking laughter of the heiress who had told her she belonged in a diner. A quiet, profound strength settled over Krista. She was no longer just the freelance book restorer from Brooklyn. She was the woman Prince Henry had chosen to stand beside him. Let them in, Krista said, her voice steady and resolute. But they don't get to come up to the house. I'll meet them at the gate, exactly where they threw me out. Walking down the sweeping limestone path toward the wrought iron gates of the Beaumont Caldwell estate, Krista felt an entirely new sensation blooming in her chest. Yesterday, this gravel driveway had been a sight of agonizing humiliation. Today, It was the stage for absolute vindication. Heavy iron barriers remained firmly shut as Krista and Henry approached, flanked by 4 elite Royal Protection officers whose faces were carved from stone. Beyond the gilded bars stood Richard Harris and his daughter. The contrast between Corinne Harris yesterday and the woman standing outside the gates today was staggering. Stripped of her Balenciaga coats, her blinding diamonds, and her sneering arrogance, Corinne looked incredibly small. She wore a plain beige trench coat, her shoulders hunched against the crisp autumn wind, her eyes red and swollen from hours of frantic crying. Richard Harris, a man who regularly bullied mayors and crushed competing developers, looked absolutely hollowed out. The moment Henry and Krista stopped on the other side of the gate, Richard immediately bowed his head, clasping his hands together in a gesture of desperate submission. "Your Grace," Richard said, his voice trembling, devoid of its usual booming authority. "I cannot adequately express the depth of my apologies for intruding upon your estate. I am here entirely at your mercy to offer my most profound, groveling apologies to your future Duchess." Henry did not look at Richard. His piercing, icy gaze remained fixed on Corinne. "You are not apologizing to a Duchess, Richard. You are apologizing to Krista Flores, the woman your daughter physically assaulted and threw into the mud." Richard sharply nudged his daughter. Corinne jolted, visibly trembling as she stepped closer to the cold iron bars. She couldn't even look Krista in the eye, her gaze fixed firmly on the gravel where she had forced Krista to bleed just 24 hours prior. "Krista, Miss Flores," Corinne stammered, her voice cracking, completely lacking the shrill, mocking tone she had weaponized in the grand foyer. I am so sorry. I was arrogant. I was cruel. I thought because I had money I could treat you like you didn't matter. I ruined your wedding binder, and I threw you out in the rain, and I am begging you to forgive me. Please, if my father's company defaults tomorrow, hundreds of people will lose their jobs. My family will lose everything. Please, do not punish my father for my vile behavior." Krista stood in silence, her hand resting securely in Henry's. She studied the heiress who had sneered at her thrifted centerpieces and called her poor. A lesser woman might have laughed. A vindictive woman might have told the guards to unleash the dogs. But Krista had spent her life carefully repairing broken, forgotten things, and she possessed a grace that no amount of sovereign wealth could buy. "Look at me, Corinne," Krista commanded, her voice steady and clear, echoing quietly in the morning air. Corinne slowly lifted her chin, tears spilling over her eyelashes, as she finally met Krista's gaze. "You didn't humiliate me yesterday because you wanted this venue," Krista said calmly, holding her ground. "You humiliated me because you enjoyed it. You looked at my clothes, my handmade binder, and my bank account, and you decided I was less human than you. You thought money was the only metric of a person's worth. I am not going to forgive you today, because your apology is only born of terror, not genuine remorse." Corinne let out a strangled, hopeless sob, burying her face in her hands. Richard's knees buckled slightly, bracing himself against the iron gate as he saw his empire evaporating into dust. "However," Krista continued, her tone softening just a fraction, "I refuse to let my marriage begin with the destruction of hundreds of innocent employees who work for your father's company. I will not become the kind of monster you were to me." Krista turned to Henry, looking up into his aristocratic face. "Henry, do not bankrupt the company. Let his employees keep their livelihoods." Henry's expression softened as he looked down at the woman he loved, completely awestruck by her boundless mercy. He brought her knuckles to his lips, kissing them gently, before turning his glacial stare back to the Harris. "You will keep your company, Richard," Henry stated, his voice cutting through the wind like a newly sharpened blade. "Deutsche Bank will restructure the debt, and your employees will remain untouched, but there is a price for your daughter's insolence." Richard nodded frantically, tears of relief shining in his eyes. "Anything, Your Grace. Name it. By 5 o'clock this evening, Harris Commercial Real Estate will liquidate its 3 primary midtown luxury properties to cover the restructuring fees," Henry commanded flawlessly. You will also immediately sell your Central Park penthouse and your Hamptons estate. The proceeds will be donated to a charity of Krista's choosing. You will no longer run within elite circles, Richard. You will live quietly, modestly, and respectfully. If I ever hear your daughter's name mentioned in high society again, or if she ever dares to disrespect someone in the service industry, I will finish what I started today. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, Your Grace," Richard gasped, nodding fervently. Thank you, Miss Flores. Thank you for your mercy." "Get off my property," Henry ordered, turning his back on the disgraced billionaires. Krista did not look back as she and Henry walked up the sweeping path toward their $45 million home. She felt a profound, weightless peace settle over her shoulders. The nightmare was over. The villains had been banished to the realm of irrelevancy, stripped of the very status they had used as a weapon. Saturday evening arrived with a breathtaking cinematic glory. The Beaumont Caldwell estate had been transformed into a living fairy tale, surpassing anything Krista could have ever dreamed of in her wildest, most ambitious fantasies. Thousands of pale blush peonies and wild English garden roses cascaded down the grand limestone staircase, winding their way through the ancient oak trees in a breathtaking display of floral artistry. The hand-blown Venetian crystal lanterns bathed the manicured lawns in a warm, fractured golden glow, casting shimmering prisms across the imported marble fountains. A 60-piece symphony orchestra, flown in directly from Vienna, was positioned on the sweeping south terrace, tuning their instruments as the sun began to dip below the Hudson Valley hills, painting the sky in vibrant shades of coral and indigo. Inside the royal guest suite, Krista stood before a towering antique gilded mirror, completely paralyzed by the reflection staring back at her. She wore an Elie Saab haute couture masterpiece, a gown that had required over 800 hours of hand embroidery by Parisian artisans. The bodice was a delicate illusion, netting adorned with thousands of microscopic Swarovski crystals and seed pearls that caught the light with every breath she took. The skirt flowed around her like liquid ivory, cascading into a cathedral-length train of exquisite Chantilly lace. Genevieve Laurent stood behind her, adjusting the delicate silk veil with practiced, reverent hands. "You are a vision, madam," Genevieve whispered softly. "A true duchess." Beatrice Flores, Krista's fiery Scottish grandmother, sat on a velvet settee, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Your mother would have been so endlessly proud of you, my sweet girl. You look like an angel." "Thank you, Gran." Krista smiled, her heart fluttering wildly against her ribs. She took a deep, steadying breath. She wasn't nervous about the cameras, or the European aristocrats sitting in the front rows, or the sheer, staggering wealth surrounding her. She was only eager to see the man, waiting for her at the end of the aisle. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and the Vienna Symphony began playing a soaring, breathtaking rendition of Pachelbel's Canon, and Krista stepped out onto the terrace, clutching a bouquet of rare white orchids. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of 150 guests. Half of them were Krista's modest, hard-working friends and family from Brooklyn. The other half were European dignitaries, senior partners from global banking firms, and members of the Royal Sovereign Trust. Yet, in that single, suspended moment, the immense divide in class and wealth completely vanished, eclipsed by the sheer, undeniable radiance of the bride. Waiting for her, under a colossal archway of woven white roses, stood Henry. He was no longer Henry Davies, the mild-mannered financial analyst. He was His Royal Highness, Prince Henry Arthur Leopold. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue ceremonial uniform of the House of Castle-Lorraine, complete with a crimson sash and the glittering silver star of his royal order pinned to his chest. He looked devastatingly handsome, an imposing figure of aristocratic authority and quiet, commanding power. But as Krista began her walk down the aisle, The stoic prince completely crumbled. Henry's eyes filled with bright, unshed tears. His chest hitched as he watched the woman he loved, the woman who had loved him when she thought he had nothing, walking toward him in a halo of golden light. He abandoned all royal protocol, stepping forward to meet her halfway down the aisle, unable to wait a single second longer. He took her trembling, lace-gloved hand in his, kissing her knuckles with a fierce, adoring devotion. "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my entire life," Henry whispered thickly, completely ignoring the hundreds of people watching them. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Your Grace," Krista whispered back, a tear slipping down her cheek as she smiled radiantly. They stood before the Archbishop of New York, their vows echoing across the lush, sprawling grounds of the estate. Krista promised to love Henry not for his crown, but for his quiet kindness, for the way he made her tea on rainy mornings, and for the fierce, unyielding way he protected her when the world tried to tear her down. Henry promised to spend the rest of his life ensuring she never felt small, never felt forgotten, and always knew that she was the true sovereign of his heart. As they exchanged heavy platinum wedding bands, a sudden, thrilling realization washed over Krista. This entire, sprawling estate, the $45 million masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, didn't just belong to the royal trust. The deed had been placed squarely in her name. She had been thrown out of this exact venue in the pouring rain, treated like garbage by people who thought they owned the world. Now, she quite literally owned the ground they had crawled on to beg for her mercy. "By the power vested in me, and under the watchful eyes of God, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Archbishop declared, his voice ringing with joyous finality. "You may kiss your bride." Henry didn't hesitate. He pulled Krista into his arms, kissing her with a deep, passionate intensity that made the entire crowd erupt into deafening applause. The symphony swelled into a triumphant crescendo, and fireworks suddenly erupted over the Hudson Valley, painting the darkening night sky in spectacular explosions of gold and crimson. Later that evening, long after the 5-course Michelin-starred dinner, after the champagne towers and the joyous dancing under the crystal chandeliers, Krista and Henry slipped away from the roaring reception. They walked hand in hand down the sweeping limestone path, the gravel crunching softly beneath their shoes. They stood by the heavy wrought iron gates, where the heiress had groveled just hours prior. Krista leaned her head against Henry's shoulder, looking back at the Beaumont Caldwell estate. It was entirely theirs. A monument to a love that couldn't be bought, and a terrifying testament to the karma that comes for those who mistake kindness for weakness. Henry wrapped his arms tightly around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, my Duchess?" Krista smiled, watching the fireworks reflect in the ancient marble fountains. "I'm just thinking about how incredibly lucky I am to have found a man who loves vintage books as much as I do." Henry laughed, a rich, warm sound that echoed into the night. He turned her around, kissing her softly under the starlit sky. "The books were just an excuse to talk to you, Krista. You were always the only treasure I was trying to secure." Did karma serve the perfect dish? When arrogance meets silent power, the downfall of a bully becomes a masterpiece of absolute vindication. Krista's journey from a discarded, tearful bride in the freezing rain to a radiant duchess owning a $45 million estate proves that true love and a secret royal bank account always wins. If you loved hearing Corinne Harris and Victoria Preston get exactly what they deserved, hit that like button right now. Share this story with anyone who loves a brilliant revenge plot, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping true-life drama.